Well, it appears that viewers of my channel really enjoy talking about Studebakers. So today, I'm going to talk about a particular series of Studebakers near the end of Studebaker's run, and that is the 1956 to 61 Studebaker Hawks and the various Hawks that existed. Many people know about the Golden Hawk, but that was just one of many. We're also going to talk about the one-year-only Packard Hawk, so stay tuned for that. But these 56 to 61 Studebakers, as I mentioned, are really kind of at the tail end of the company's history. And in 1966, Studebaker would produce its final vehicles before going defunct a few years thereafter. But the 56 to 61 also represent kind of the last of the line and in a number of ways, one of which is it's the last of the so-called Loewy-designed vehicles, or vehicles that were designed by Raymond Loewy and his team for Studebaker before those responsibilities would be taken over internally by Studebaker designers, including Dick Teague, who would later become the chief designer for American Motors Corporation after he left Studebaker. So these vehicles are kind of the last of the Raymond Loewy designed vehicles, and they also kind of straddle an interesting time period for Studebaker, namely between the beautiful 1953 Studebaker coupes and hardtop coupes that came out and the beautiful 1962 Gran Turismo Hawk that was restyled, the restyled version of these cars by Brooks Stevens, who did a fantastic job on that car. These 56 to 61s aren't necessarily the best from a look standpoint, but a lot of people like them, and so we're going to talk about them today. Now, as I said, Studebaker was really setting some styling trends with the 1953 coupe, both the pillared coupe as well as the hardtop coupe that were introduced in that particular model year. And those were done, again, by Raymond Loewy and the individuals in his studio, including Bob Bork. And the 53 set so many new trends in styling that the big three emulated for years. This beautiful taper to the front and the rear of the vehicle where it kind of narrows as the vehicle, as you look toward the extreme ends of the car, and overall height of the vehicle was extremely low for the time period. Remember, this was during a time frame when Detroit was producing many broad-shouldered and tall-waisted cars. Taking a look at this 53 Chevrolet, for an example. A very tall design, and contrast that with the 53 Studebaker that was very low-slung, not just in overall height, but even the hood itself was very, very low. So low, in fact, that Studebaker engineers had to redesign the air cleaner assemblies to make sure they could package it along with the engine under hood appropriately. And out back, the 53 Studebaker was also just gorgeous with this deck lid flowing into the bumper, and the bumper would have admittedly been even more graceful if Studebaker had more money to integrate the tail lamps into the bumper like designers wanted, as opposed to making them two pieces. But back to the 1956 to 61 Studebaker Hawks as well as the Packard Hawk. Now, these cars came out in October of 1955, and they retained the 120.5-inch wheelbase chassis and really the basic forms of that gorgeous 1953 to 55 Studebaker Starlight and Starliner. Strangely, these coupes, as well as the coupes that preceded them, those that came out in 1953, rode atop that 120.5-inch wheelbase, and the sedans and wagons rode atop a smaller wheelbase, 116.5 inches. And the overall car then had this beautiful proportion, beautiful dash to axle, the front wheel pushed way out from the windshield, something that Detroit would emulate in terms of that longer, lower, wider theme for many years to come. When they were introduced in October of 1955, it was kind of hard for individuals to look at these and think Studebaker. After all, there weren't really any identifying elements of the cars that kind of screamed Studebaker. The fronts had this very Mercedes-esque look to them with that stand-up grille in many cases, and the overall design cues were not necessarily unique. There wasn't a brand identity, if you will, for Studebaker, and part of that perhaps was a bit by intent. These cars were more conservatively styled than the 1953 to 1955s that preceded them, but many think that they were still decent lookers. And it's probably because the head of Studebaker-Packard, James Nance, insisted that there be a full lineup of cars and also that they be a bit more conservative than the 1953 to 1955 models. By the way, James Nance would later go on to Ford, where he would also have a lack of success in running some Ford Motor Company divisions. But nonetheless, I digress. As a consequence, though, when introduced, there were actually 4 different Hawks. Many people know about the Golden Hawk that was at the top of the lineup in that inaugural model year. But there was actually the Flight Hawk, the Power Hawk, the Sky Hawk, and then the Golden Hawk. And I say those in terms of their ascending order of price point, as well as, frankly, power under their hood. More specifically, the budget-conscious buyers were likely to buy the $1,986 Flight Hawk. And $1,986 back then was the equivalent of about $23,000, $24,000 today. So relatively cheap. And by the way, the Flight Hawk was only available in the pillared coupe body shell, and it came with Studebaker's 101 horsepower, 186 cubic inch flathead 6-cylinder engine, inline 6-cylinder engine. So it was relatively underpowered, let's say, but it sufficed. Then there was the Power Hawk that also came, generally speaking, in the pillared coupe sedan format, but there were 500 pillarless Flight Hawks that were also built. Those are principally for export sales. If you see one of those are extremely rare. Those came with Studebaker's 259 cubic inch, 170 horsepower V8 engine that was used in their regular Commander series. And those Power Hawks had a price of about $2,100, roughly the equivalent of about $25,000, $26,000 today. So still relatively affordable. Then the next up the rung was the Sky Hawk that had a, well, let's just say, good look to it relative to the others. And it was powered by the 289 cubic inch version of the Studebaker V8 that had been introduced for 1956. And the Skyhawk really had one thing going for it. It was the most powerful Studebaker Hawk variant that you could get with a V8 underhood, and it didn't have those silly fiberglass rear quarter panel fins. So it tended to look a little bit better than some of the other Hawks. And the Skyhawk stickered for about $2,477, roughly the equivalent of $28,000, $29,000 today. Then at the top of the rung was the Golden Hawk for 1956. That stickered over $3,000, $3,061, roughly the equivalent of $33,000 today. And that one had a number of distinguishing features. It was easily identified from the other Hawks by the fiberglass fins that were kind of appended to the quarter panels, and it had these bright wheel arch moldings as well as alloy moldings above the rocker panels and stainless steel roof band that kind of mimicked the 1955 Studebaker Speedster. Many of the Golden Hawks also were sold with the Regal wire wheel covers that were first used on the 1953 Studebakers. But the best part about the Golden Hawk was really what was not seen from the surface, and that was what was under hood, because the Golden Hawk got Packard's 352 cubic inch V8 with 275 horsepower. This was really the most powerful car when you think about what Chevrolet and Ford were offering, as well as Plymouth for 1956, although that would change for 1957 when Chevrolet would introduce fuel injection in the 283 cubic inch engine, making 283 horsepower. But for 56, in the Studebaker Golden Hawk, you could get 275 horsepower because it had the Packard V8, and that was really an awesome engine to put under hood in these Golden Hawks that endowed it with, let's say, a 0 to 60 time about 7.8 seconds. And while that doesn't sound fast today, 7.8 seconds by 1956 standards was really blisteringly fast, kind of Corvette-esque fast, to be honest. Now, of course, the downside to putting that Packard V8 was that it was pretty nose-heavy, as you can imagine, in these vehicles. It's almost like having an extra couple hundred pounds over the front wheels. And some, let's say, testers of the era were relatively gracious when it came to their tests of the Golden Hawk, and others said that it was really just something that understeered quite significantly. Certainly by modern standards, it would have understeered. The vehicles had bias ply tires, were very nose-heavy, so certainly compared to modern standards, they definitely understeered with that Packard V8. But you got to love the fact that they did have the Packard V8, and they had that Packard V8 for 1956, And that was really it. You can only get the Packard V8 in the 1956 model year. And just to compare that to other vehicles of the time, in the Chevrolet Corvette, you were getting, let's say, at most 225 horsepower for 1956. The T-Bird, 225 horsepower. The Packard Caribbean, you could get 310 horsepower. The Chrysler 300B, you could get 340 horsepower. But of course, the 300B was a heavier vehicle, weighed almost 4,200 pounds compared to the Golden Hawk's 3,400 pounds. So 275 horsepower and 3,400 pounds made it a pretty gosh darn peppy vehicle. So if you bought one of these Golden Hawks, you got a relatively peppy vehicle for something that was quite economical for the time. Now, the sales, unfortunately, weren't all that great, probably because Studebaker wasn't afforded a lot of money for the redo. It effectively was a new grille, a hood, and some changes to the rear, like the fiberglass rear quarters and the deck lid on the Golden Hawk. And the total production on the Power Hawk and Flight Hawks was 11,484 for 1956. The Skyhawk total production was 3,600. The Golden Hawk totaled just 4,100 units for 1956. And as I said, the best part about the 1956 model year Golden Hawk was that it had that Packard V8 making 275 horsepower, also 380 pound-feet of torque. Unfortunately, by the time 1957 rolled around, the Packard V8 was no more. So the 352 cubic inch V8 was no more, although Studebaker did dump a McCulloch supercharger on the Golden Hawk for 1957 on their 289 cubic inch engine, and it made the same 275 horsepower, but only 333 pound-feet of torque. And that was a significant increase versus in 1957, the standard 289 that made 210 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. And if it had the optional 4-barrel carburetor, it made 225 horsepower and 305 pound-feet of torque. So the supercharger really did help. The McCulloch supercharger, McCulloch actually offered them, as you can see in this particular ad for the time, for many different vehicles. And Ford used it in the Thunderbird, but Studebaker used it in the Golden Hawk. And it was a pretty innovative setup because the supercharger ran at a couple different speeds. It wasn't just a one-speed supercharger. If you, let's say, really stepped on the accelerator, there was a vacuum switch that enabled the supercharger to spin faster up to 3,500 RPM. That was the max governed speed. And if it started to exceed that, it would go into a slower mode. But like I said, the supercharger was kind of loafing along if you were just accelerating normally, and only in the event that you stepped on it would it allow the supercharger to speed up to about 35,000 RPM. And that meant that it added, let's say, an additional 5 PSI of manifold pressure. So it was pretty peppy, but you can imagine the complexity of the supercharger is quite high, and especially if you're trying to collect one nowadays, versus the regular Studebaker Golden Hawks of 1956 that have the 352 Packard V8. Well, that Packard V8's relatively bulletproof and doesn't have any complexity. The 57s with that supercharger are a little bit more complicated. Now, unfortunately, because of the relatively poor sales of the 1956 Hawk lineup, it was really trimmed for 1957. There was just the Golden Hawk that continued over for 1957 from 1956. And then the pillared Silver Hawk. There was nothing else. Just those two particular offerings. And there were some styling changes for 1957. More specifically, Studebaker had a new styling chief named Duncan McRae, who decided to add these much larger fins to the vehicles with kind of a concave section to them. They look okay. And gave it a little bit of something new for 1957. And there were a few features that were new under hood, aside from that supercharged V8 engine that I mentioned. The transmissions were also different. Now Studebaker was using a Borg-Warner unit versus the old Packard automatic that tended to have trouble in terms of reliability when it was behind some of the more powerful engines. And Studebaker also gave the Hawks finned brake drums for 1957. Yes, before that time frame, the brake drums weren't even finned. And they had what Studebaker called the twin traction limited slip differential for 57. That was first released on the 1956 Packard and was optional with any V8 engine in your Studebaker. And while the Golden Hawk got that supercharged Studebaker V8 making 275 horsepower, the lower Silver Hawk could have a choice of 3 engines, the same old flathead inline 6, and then a couple different versions of Studebaker's 289 cubic inch V8. Now you always got the larger V8 underhood in your Hawk. One made 210 horsepower, the other made 225 horsepower. Unfortunately, the changes really didn't help the Hawk sales. The Golden Hawk sold about 4,400 units. The Silver Hawk sold about 15,000 units, so roughly flat in sales year over year. Certainly nothing to write home about. And for 1958, things wouldn't get much rosier, although now you could get air conditioning in your Studebaker for the first time. And the wheels actually shrunk by an inch to 14-inch diameter to help make the car appear a bit lower. It lowered the ride height overall. And for 1958, there was a special model, the so-called Packard Hawk. As I mentioned before, this was a one-year-only vehicle that had very strange front-end styling, kind of duckbill styling, if you will. The styling was allegedly inspired by the Maserati 3500 GT, maybe a little bit, but certainly more duckbilly on the Studebaker. And the person who was fond of the styling was allegedly Roy Hurley, who was president of Curtiss Wright. Curtiss Wright would later acquire Studebaker-Packard, and because he was fond of it, they decided to make a car for him, I suppose. But the Packard Hawk had this low fiberglass hood and that duckbill or catfish mouth, and it also had some differences in the rear where it borrowed the trunk lid from the 1953 to 55 coupes, and it was adorned with a simulated spare tire cover, similar to what was going on at Chrysler with the toilet bowl Imperial rear deck lid. Perhaps the strangest thing about the 58 Packard Hawk, or the so-called Packard Baker, as some people call it, was that the armrest spilled over onto the exterior of the car. And apparently, the Studebaker designers were trying to just give the appearance that the exterior was, let's say, safer, that this was almost like a crash padding, if you will, similar to aircraft cockpits. But it looks especially bizarre. Some other auto companies tried it. To mind, the most infamous variant was something like the late 70s Chrysler LeBaron, which just doesn't look all that great. So that was the Packard Hawk. It only sold 588 units in 1958. The Golden Hawk sold 878 units. The combined Silver Hawk V8 and 6-cylinder sold 7,300 units. For 1959, the Packards were all gone. So was the Packard Hawk. And there was just the Silver Hawk, and it sold about 8,000 units. And for 1960 and 61, there was just the Hawk, period. And the total production in 1960 was 4,500 units, in 1961, 3,900 units. So not much to kind of write home about for 1960 and 1961, as the Hawk just kind of faded away into automotive history. Unfortunately, the 1959 models also suffered in that they got a downsized 170 cubic inch 6-cylinder with just 90 horsepower and the smaller 259 cubic inch Studebaker V8, though you could still get power steering, brakes, air conditioning as available equipment. And Studebaker even dropped the fin brake drums from the 6-cylinder automatic combination. So really was a step backward. In 1960, the 6-cylinder was dropped and Studebaker went back to the 289 cubic inch V8. And you could also get headrests and a tachometer and even a split bench seat in the 1960 Studebaker. And that's the tale of the various Hawks from Studebaker for 1956 through 61. Some great vehicles that unfortunately kind of went out with a whimper, but a few of the last Studebakers and the last of the Loewy-designed vehicles. What do you think of them? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.